my question to you is, can you explain what happens in Zero Hour to the best of your knowledge?
To the best of my knowledge.
And you can start broad. You can start big and broad and be like, what was Zero Hour?
Timey-wimey shenanigans.
Okay, that's a good start. Yeah. And welcome back to the Men of Steel podcast. I'm Case Aiken, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Jmike Folsom.
I'm so confused, Case. Oh, also, hello, everybody. But I'm still so confused, Case. I have no idea what's going on.
That is the general state of things, as they were in 1994 when DC did the event Zero Hour. And to have a conversation about Zero Hour, but from the perspective of a Superman fan who was only buying the Superman books. So to have that conversation, we are joined by Grant Richter from the Truth, Justice, and Hope podcast.
Hey, guys. Oops, sorry. I jumped in a little early there. Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me back. I'm super excited.
Yeah. I'm so glad to have you back on. I love that a niche that you're sort of carving out for yourself has been sort of like the 90s books that I really want to talk about.
Yes. I am quite the 90s aficionado. In fact, I think 1994, the year Zero Hour came out, is like one of the best years in DC publishing history. Not just because of Zero Hour, but for so many other things that came out that year. But ironically, I don't think the Superman books are exactly at their best in 94, but I think the Zero Hour tie-ins are really, really good.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to kind of like look at the state of Superman at the time. I think that the Superman books as a larger concept, I'm a huge fan of the 90s Superboy book, and that's sort of where my head goes. Like that book is just so good, and the tie-in issue that we'll talk about is without a doubt my favorite issue in this collection that we're talking about. The team is just firing on all cylinders, and like a big part of that is just that Tom Grummett artwork is so on point. Yes. It looks so wonderful, and it's just like such a formative thing for me as a fan of comics, but as a fan that got into DC Comics really because of the Superboy book itself. Like that, this issue that we're going to talk about today is the book that got me into being a DC Comics fan.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So like I think it holds up very well, and I'm extremely excited to talk about all of these issues. Like it's an interesting collection. But yeah, Superman's in a weird space here. This is coming off of the Doomsday Death and Return cycle. This is the point when we've got a few books coming out as spin-offs, or the Superman line is almost at its peak. Mm-hmm. We haven't quite gotten to, or it may have happened. Superman Man of Tomorrow, the quarterly book. I forget exactly when that starts, but it's somewhere around here.
Yeah, and at that point, that is 95. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So like when that is running, and also Supergirl, which has not started yet at this point, start running, the Superman family of books will be at sort of their peak in terms of like full books that are being published. So here we're almost there. We haven't quite hit that sort of like upper limit of Superman books, but there's certainly quite an interesting space. I mean, we've got mullet Superman going on right now.
Yep.
We've got a shakeup in some of the departments.
It is poorly kempt long hair.
It is true. It is not actually a mullet. It's weird when artists draw it as a mullet. Yes. Like there are some artists have like made it look more like a mullet because and everyone calls it mullet Superman,
right? But
it's long-haired Superman, and like when it does look like a mullet, it's like, oh, that's a strange design for this character.
Yeah, unfortunately, one of my favorite artists of the 90s, Stuart Immerman, who is not in this group of artists, he draws it full on mullet, which is unfortunate, but I really like Stuart Immerman.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, we're firmly in the triangle era of Superman at this point. You know, we are about to see some of the cool interconnected events when we start having Superboy and Steel really like coming into their own. Like their series have each just started at this point, especially when Supergirl is also running. Like we will be seeing like crossover and like a larger continuity between all the books So this is early in that formation of that sort of editorial arc. And it's also tied into all of the stuff going on with this big event of Zero Hour.
Yes.
So this is confusing. And the order we read this in, I think, was alphabetical, which is not necessarily the actual appropriate reading order for them. But I'm going to keep it that way because that's the only way that I'm going to stay sane trying to put together the pieces. And I think it works pretty well. But we shall see. But yeah, so I want to open the conversation today with a little bit of a game.
Okay.
Oh gosh.
Jmike.
Yes, Case.
Have you ever read Zero Hour?
No, I'm gonna be upfront. I'm not gonna pretend that I know. No, I'm just gonna say no. I've never read Zero Hour, Case.
Okay.
Please enlighten me.
No. I don't want to right now. What I want to know is, considering the fact that you have now read what 5, 6 tie-in books to Zero Hour, maybe 7, because we did initially think that there was an issue of Steel that was a tie-in to Zero Hour because it was published in the same month of it all, but it actually has no story connections whatsoever, which was a little bit of a bummer because we know the artist on that book, because that was Chris Batista, who did the logo for Men of Steel.
Nice.
But so you've read these tie-in books, and you are a person who has read a lot of stuff that has come out from this era, because the format for the show is a lot of times me saying, hey, I would really like to talk about this thing. How do you feel about talking about it with me? And you say, okay. And then I force you to read 30 issues of a comic. And then we try to digest that in a period of time. So
only 7. It's fine.
We've been doing this for 5-6 years now. So yeah, you've absorbed a lot of comic information from this point. And my question to you is, can you explain what happens in Zero Hour to the best of your knowledge?
To the best of my knowledge,
and you can start broad. You can start big and broad and be like, what was Zero Hour?
Timey-wimey shenanigans.
Okay, that's a good start. Yeah.
Dude, so if I'm gonna go off on a limb here, okay, so I read all these issues that you sent me. The guy Valor, we see him in which episode was that? I think it was Valor 23. You see him and he goes back and he and his girlfriend, I guess, are flying through the time waves and trying to figure out what's going on. And then they get separated. He gets sucked back through time. He sees the Trapper. Is that his name, I guess?
Yeah, the Time Trapper, yeah.
Yeah, and I think we saw him before in one of our other Legion excursions.
Yes, yeah, okay, so yes, you've homed in on the area that is ultimately the most impactful to the story that we're looking at today.
Mm-hmm.
This is ultimately a Legion of Superheroes story, because this is the point where the Legion of Superheroes went from what was called the 5 years later period, where they had jumped forward in time 5 years, obviously, and then had this kind of grim, dark future that got real weird from the era that we had looked at last. So when we looked at the death of Superboy, there was a lot of issue with Superboy still being technically part of the Legion, and so editorial was you got to get rid of that, and so that kind of was the kickoff to it. It really wasn't. It really was going to happen anyway, and then they 4 or 5 issues in, they had to do this time warp event that erased the Pocket Universe Superboy from continuity, but not everyone got the notes on that one. So that became a thing, but it introduced characters like Laurel Gand as a replacement for Supergirl in it, and it's this whole period of grim dark future Legion of Superhero stuff that then had clones of them and just became kind of difficult to explain. I can't explain the 5 years later arc to you. It's 2 giant omnibi if you want to read it, and it took me a long time to get through it all because there's so much stuff to it all, and it stops mattering the second this book comes out. It is erased by Zero Hour, and then that becomes the reboot era, which is when we looked at Legion Lost, which is one of the highlights of the reboot era of Legion of Superheroes. So Legion of Superheroes, which while they had to deal with the Crisis on Infinite Earths shattering their continuity a little bit, theoretically had been a consistent team all the way up until Zero Hour, and Zero Hour becomes the send off to the Legion of Superheroes in a very real way, and it is completely wiped out and rebuilt from the ground up with the reboot era. And then there's other stuff that's happening. So like we've made some references. So now let's dig a little bit deeper. You've figured out like what is the core part of this, and you figured out like the broad strokes. I mean, Zero Hour has the subtitle "Crisis in Time" for the record. Yeah. So it is very much a sequel to Crisis on Infinite Earths. So now, what else can you kind of like home in on?
There, Superman sent out like a beacon message through time and space. He's like, all heroes, if you get this message, please meet us at the UN building in New York as fast as you can. And then it goes through time and space. Like Supergirl hears it. All of the Batmen throughout time hear it. I also like the fact that when you see the Batman episode, they're all like drawn out in their own particular little designs from the book they're from.
Yep.
That was pretty cool. But
so you've actually, like, you just alluded to a thing that is a big part of this story. So there's multiple versions of characters that start popping up throughout this all. So you start seeing the different versions. Like we see it with the Superboys, we see it with Legion, actually very much, but like it's already like a weird situation with the Legion. We see it all over, and the Batman one specifically, but it's a chance for them to like kind of deal with some of the multiverse stuff and to have different time versions and different reality versions of characters. It's the first time DC's like allowing people to wade into that since Crisis on Infinite Earths, not counting Animal Man.
We also get like where you get to see Jor-El and Lara, I forget her name. Superman's parents from Krypton show up. Things get weird for a while. He then goes to this weird alternate universe where he finds the Alpha Centurion. Who was that? Was it Mark Anthony or who was it? I forgot his name.
I forget.
Yeah, no, it's fuck. What is it?
It's like Marcus Aurelius, but not.
Yeah,
Marcus Aurelius. Right. There you go. Oh, it was one of those guys. I couldn't remember which one. But yeah, that he got sucked up through time with aliens, and he came back like 10,000 years later almost. And he decided to become a superhero because, of course...
So Exo Manowar, basically.
Yeah, no, it's super that, although inverted, because it's instead of the barbarian fighting the Romans, it's the actual Roman.
Right.
But it's... yeah, no, that the cool part for this one is that this is the introduction of a character who will later show up in DC Comics. Like, he shows up like a year or two later with a cooler design. I prefer the redesign that he gets.
You don't like... What is it? Just like the golden armor, gold and blue armor with the cape and the helmet.
I mean, I don't mind it. It's just not as good as the version that we get with the redesign, which plays in more to like the Roman Centurion kind of look, or really it kind of looks more like a Grecian hero. But regardless, it looks more like of a, I don't know.
So it looks better without the helmet too.
Also definitely true.
The helmet's kind of goofy.
To be fair, I thought he had fallen into the Lazarus pit because I was so confused about what else was going on here and the continuities of everything. And I was like, oh, he has a Lazarus pit too. How interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it could be an artificial one from if you get into a broader perspective of things.
I have no idea what's going on at this point. I'm just like, I've never seen this guy before. And then I feel bad for Superman after a while because like after a certain point in the comics, like every time it's either him or Superboy, like no one remembers who he is. Like Superboy like gets zapped from talking to the Legion and like giving a big rah-rah speech that he gets zapped through time. And then he goes back and he talks to, I think it was Lana, who's like, I forget how much, like he left when they were 18 and she comes back and she's married to Pete.
Right.
And he's still like a kid almost. And then he's like, I gotta go find my parents. And then what's our Superboy's name or the 90s Superboy's name?
Well, at this point, he doesn't have a name. He is just Superboy.
Thought he had a name.
Legally and everything. He would later be named Con-El and then later Connor Kent.
Oh, and I have to point out, it never occurred to me that Con-El was an anagram of clone until you pointed it out on your YouTube video.
Oh, yeah.
So, not the surface hack.
Writers think they're so clever.
More clever than me.
Like no one, no one knows who he is. No one remembers who he is. And then like you get Clark's parents from Krypton come up and they're like, "Our son, we've been searching the whole cosmos for you." And he's like, "What do you mean? Krypton exploded." They're like, "No, we're still here. Krypton didn't explode. Also, you have a brother." And a bunch of nieces and nephews.
I have serious thoughts when we get to that issue.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly an excuse to do it's a lot of like what ifs kind of things, and a lot of like playing around with like different versions of characters. So you've kind of hit that area specifically. However, from the issues that we read, we are not going to really get into the actual plot of Zero Hour because they're just it's not anything. This is all like very like side story kind of stuff. It's the wake of the ship that's moving through it. So the big idea is that initially it's the villain Extant, who is a revamped version of the character Monarch, specifically the version of Monarch that was a version of Hawk in the future, who had become a villain.
Mm-hmm.
And he had gained chronal powers or like time powers, and so was going to do this whole thing like erasing time from the end of time, working its way backwards, which feels like how they always erase time in comics. And that was going to be some sort of whole thing so he could do like Big Bang, whatever. So this causes a bunch of like whole situations where like heroes start popping up from different realities. And remember, at this point, DC does not allow a multiverse. So there is no possibility that these characters can exist without either overwriting the current continuity or being wiped out themselves. And so like Barbara Gordon as Batgirl shows up, and then like the Alpha Centurion shows up. And so you get all these characters that are supposed to represent like other possibilities. And so there is a certain amount of drama where the quest to resolve this like crisis that is causing like alternate versions of people and so forth, and like, you know, reality kind of warping itself, and like the future itself being destroyed and working its way backwards, and all this stuff. The quest to fix it is going to inevitably like kill a lot of people, because the actual timeline, like whatever, you're settling on one timeline. So the Alpha Centurion, for example, is a character who has to be like, as far as I know, like what we are talking about is erasing my metropolis and my home, my world, my relationship with Lois, etc. And like it's a difficult journey for them. And then everything gets fucked up because it's revealed that the actual villain of the story is not Extant. It is actually Parallax. Pardon me. Parallax. Pardon me. It is actually Parallax. AKA Hal Jordan, AKA the former Green Lantern of Earth.
My favorite version of Hal Jordan.
I actually love this costume, and I came into comics in this era, so this is like, for me, I'm used to the fallen Green Lantern Hal Jordan,
right,
as like the basic way to go with him. And this is where he is at like his like Thanos level, like I'm going to wipe out the universe with like a snap of my fingers kind of character arc. So like this is where like we really get like Kyle out there. This is where Impulse joins the DCU. It's right before he gets his own book. And so like, again, like I was a teenager like getting into DC Comics, or like a junior high kid, and like Impulse was a big like avenue for me, like sort of like understanding teens, and as silly as that is in retrospect.
Well, I mean that totally makes sense. I mean, one of the reasons I like this era so much, I was 20 when this came out, and I started reading DC with Raymond the Superman, so I just rolled right into 94. When Kyle Rayner got introduced, I'm like, I could relate to Kyle so much, just being like an early 20s like wannabe creative kind of slacker who has to like figure shit out and learn how to function like an adult. I mean, like, that was real for me.
This is a wild era when you think about it, where there are plenty of characters who were starting to represent like what was the actual like Generation X representation on of like the next step of superheroes. So like if Hal Jordan was the 60s Green Lantern and he had a career that went, 30 years at this point, like, you could say 25, 30 years, and then passed on the torch. Same with like Barry Allen to Wally West. Like all of a sudden the hero like that actually like kind of fits. Like, it's not as solid a trade-off as the golden age to the silver age junction. But, you know, aside from characters like Superman and Batman, who have been continuously published regardless, so they're just like perpetual superheroes, this was the last point where you could say it made sense that the golden age characters are still out there. And then you also have like 20-something superheroes who are like, you know, getting their feet wet in the industry, learning the ropes kind of characters. After this point, it will always be weird to have a golden age character around. And it's kind of represented because Extant has a fight with the JSA in here, which Jmike, this DC has never known what to do with the JSA ever. Like, really? I think really ever, but especially after the Crisis on Infinite Earths. Yeah. Like, it is a thing that is just difficult for them to deal with, and they didn't want to lean into them at this period. We are still a ways from the JSA like ongoing series that
Geoff Johns.
No, well, Geoff Johns ultimately takes over from, but
Robinson.
Yes, James Robinson would start.
Right.
Why am I blanking on it? But yeah, so the Robinson JSA series, which, you know, certainly like cemented like, oh yeah, we can have them as like the elder statesman characters in the background. At this point, DC was trying to get rid of them, and so they have this like weird fight where a lot of them are either killed or their power sources are destroyed, or they are aged up so that they can't really function, and some of this matters and some of it doesn't. The biggest thing that matters in the long run is when we get to Our Man. He dies in this fight, but they set up this whole thing where he has 1 hour of time that he gets to share with his son, like trapped in this like extra dimensional or extra time, I guess it's still extra dimensional. It's extra fourth dimensional space that or that his son is able to travel to, and so that like that's kind of like a fun detail in that series. So that's, I think, the only one that like really ultimately matters. Everything else is like, oh, he's aged up, but then the next time they need like Jay Garrick to be like a viable character, he's like young enough still to be a superhero.
Yeah, it's like he goes from looking like my 90-something-year-old grandfather to looking like he's a fit 60.
Yeah, exactly. Like it doesn't really matter for the characters that are going to matter, and the characters that don't matter don't matter. They've passed the torch so many times for some of these characters. Like there have been so many iterations of the Sandman. There have been so many iterations of Dr. Midnight. Like it's all fine. So yeah, that's the broad strokes on it. Like I said, Parallax takes over, and ultimately they have to like restart time. They use Damage, who is revealed to be, if I remember correctly, he's Cyclotron's son, right?
Terry Curtis.
Yeah. And thus the godson of the Atom, Al Pratt.
Yep.
So his whole deal is that he's monstrously powerful, but he has no control over his powers. And so he's another one of these like 90s characters that was like coming out at the time, and it was like very in vogue. And so they used him to restart time and like create a new Big Bang. And like that's all fun. And everything gets like formed mostly the same. Like they just like smooth over some of the weird inconsistencies of retcons for characters. And then they tried to smooth over Hawkman in such a way that is so bad that they like put a moratorium on using Hawkman after that. Like they fuse all the versions of Hawkman from throughout like time into one quote unquote like a new god type being that just isn't good. and so they get rid of the character until Geoff Johns brings him back in a way that is like, yeah, don't worry about it. Just he's a guy with wings. He resurrects. It's fine. Don't worry about it, guys. Don't worry about it. Yeah, it's a Wild Ed series. Grant, you read it more frequently than I do and have read it more recently than I have. Do you have like big notes that you want to bring up?
I don't like crisis events in general. Like, the original Crisis is beautiful to look at. I'm not a Mark Wolfman fan, so it's not a very good read for me, but it's a beautiful piece. I don't like Infinite Crisis at all. And all the other ones after that have been just, okay, whatever. I think just for nostalgia's sake, I really, really like Zero Hour. Because like that was when I was first coming into DC, and I was old enough to be an adult and do what I want, but not far enough along in adulthood that I had all the responsibilities. It was just kind of this Goldilocks era of just having a good time. And it's objectively not a great story. No offense to Dan Jurgens, he was given a lot to smush into 5 issues. When compared to the original Crisis, it comes across as very truncated. And like my biggest criticism of it is most of the action in Zero Hour takes place in the tie-ins up until the last 2 issues. And so it doesn't really read like a complete story in the first 3 issues of it, but there's just something about it that I just really like. And, you know, I am a big fan of Damage, who's one of the most underrated characters of the 90s, partly because he has my first name. He had the same haircut I had in high school, and he lived in Atlanta, where I lived when I was in high school.
I should note, he had the same haircut that we all had.
Yeah. And, you know, a character that gets royally screwed over by Geoff Johns in the aughts. You know, I like that he's the source of the Big Bang. I like that, you know, Kyle plays a big part in it. I like that just in the Green Lantern tie-in, you get this, you know, beautiful shot of Alan Scott in his awesome 90s costume with the giant, like, Doctor Strange pop collar.
Thank
and all
you.
that.
I love his 90s look.
Yes.
It is so goddamn good.
It is.
I prefer it with the Lantern logo over the Sentinel logo, which is another scenario of, like, Alan Scott is one word. Like, it literally doesn't matter. He's the first Green Lantern. They'll keep bringing him back.
He's just the coolest. Yeah.
They found the way. But I really liked his 90s look here, where it's a streamlined. I wish that his bodysuit was like black instead of red, but that's just because the original color scheme is literally he uses the word garish to describe himself in the first issue of Green Lantern.
Right.
Like he's the suit's a lot, but I love it. I love Alan Scott. And like this was like the coolest version of that look for me.
Yeah, Alan Scott's just amazing. He's, you know, probably top 5 favorite DC characters. But like I said, it's not a series that necessarily makes sense, but it's got my favorite version of Hal Jordan, who I always think of as having been a bigger deal for a longer amount of time. Hal was only Parallax for like 2 years, but it seems like a lot longer in retrospect.
Really? Like, holy...
Like early 90s.
When was Final Night?
Final Night was late 90s, so 2.5 years, like early 94 to late 96.
I can't believe it was that long.
Like when it was going on, like I was like, man, he's got to have been around for like 10 years, but like, no, not really. He became.
I know. You saying that is like blowing my mind. Oh my god, it was 1996.
That's right before the
wedding.
My
god.
Because
that's
how Clark lost his powers to be able to get his hair cut before the wedding.
Oh wow. That makes me feel gross, because you're right. That does make it only like 2 years. But I feel the same way. I felt like he was Parallax for a long time. Like I thought that the fallen Hal was a big deal.
Yeah. I mean, he got his own action figure in the Total Justice line. He was in at least, I think he was in 2 Marvel DC crossovers. He was always popping up in Kyle's book. In my opinion, he should have been a Superman antagonist, because it makes, you know, if you work in Hal's delusions, he could say like, well, you know, my city got destroyed by the cyborg, but yours survived, and your villain killed my city, and because he was trying to ruin your name, so it's really your fault, Superman.
Right.
That would have been really awesome. But you know,
of any character, for him to have like that dynamic with Superman makes the most sense.
Yeah.
Because like why would he care about what Kyle thinks? Like
exactly. this new guy who just showed up, but yeah, I mean, it's
sure you're Green Lantern now.
Sure.
Okay, son.
Right.
Have at it, Skip.
Yeah. You know, I've listened to a lot of podcasts by people who are probably a little older than me that maybe have more attachment to things like All-Star Squadron than I did, which, you know, I was very young when All-Star Squadron came out. Who were like very upset by how the JSA was dismantled in Zero Hour. I think it was a really ham-handed decision by DC, but, you know, it led to one of the best ongoing DC series ever. And I have really a love-hate relationship, mixed feelings about Geoff Johns, but JSA is quantifiably, objectively great.
Oh, I thought you were about to reference the James Robinson Starman, which does spin off directly out of this book.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, that's another reason 94 is one of the best years of DC. You get Kyle, you get Damage, you get a Hunter Prey, you get Starman, there's all this amazing stuff that came out of this one year.
Yeah, Mike, if there's ever a time that we do a spin-off show of this show to do like specifically a one comic book run, Starman is like up there as like a real option for that, because Starman is like so goddamn good, and it's pretty long.
Yeah, from 94 to 2001.
Yeah.
Holy crap.
It's a long ass run with like a consistent creative team asking the big questions of like, well, why doesn't Reed Richards just fix all the science stuff? Right. And like really leaning into that, because Starman is like another tech hero, and it's his son like trying to like live up to his dad, who is now like trying to just like invent cool shit, and while his son is the superhero but has to like learn to understand like the science thing, but he's more of like an art guy, like he's all tattooed up and everything, and like it's such a perfect Gen X superhero.
It's very, very relatable.
Yeah, like it should have been Ethan Hawke playing him in a movie.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's just beautiful stuff.
Yeah,
and some of the best artwork in comics ever from the artist whose name I'm blanking on. Tony
Starman is Tony Harris.
Yes.
So the creative team of James Robinson and Tony Harris, like such a great team that does the whole run. It's such an incredible series that really only works in the era of post Zero Hour, trying to figure out like what the landscape of DC was like, which is another thing we should bring up, which is following Zero Hour, every comic had a zero issue, which served as here's an explanation of what our timeline is. And so at some point, either in story or like a narrator scenario explains the entire timeline of the main character, and has like some kind of flashback at some point. So like the Superboy one, for example, like he fights an old villain of his, and then he like gives his origin story to Professor Emil Hamilton, who then like, you know, gives him, it's the issue that he gets his X-ray specs. But the big bulk of it is just like, oh yeah, here's your deal. And he's a flashback story of like when he first was Superboy for the first time, when he was pretending to be Superman, I should say. But that's how most of those Zero Hour issues went. We're not talking about any of those today, because those are all generally just stories set in the ongoing book, just like trying to recalibrate, you know, where the character is in continuity at this point, with the exceptions of the Legion of Superheroes, which those two Zero issues are the origin story of the Legion of Superheroes.
And also the reboot Legion, another reason 1994 is one of the best years ever.
And the reboot Legion comes on real strong. It is a real good book when it first comes out. It runs a little long before it gets the shakeup for Legion Lost, but it is a real good book, and it is one that I really loved when it first came out, and I continued to enjoy the whole series. So yeah, like that's 94. Like man. The Legion, you know, I'm gonna say we should just like start with Valor, because there's no way we're gonna have like a conversation about this whole thing without basically covering this whole goddamn story. So the Legion, which is the biggest thing about Zero Hour, at least in terms of lasting damage from Zero Hour, because fuck, man, like when you get down to it, this is the thing that like really breaks the Legion going forward, because up until this point they had never had like a hard reboot, and like having a hard reboot on the Legion all of a sudden made it open season for hard reboots. The 3-boot, which, you know, I thought was actually a perfectly good era of Legion comics, like unfortunately is the one where it's like, yep, no, we're just gonna reboot it whenever we really need to start over again. And I'm not bashing the decision to do so, but like in the long term, like we have had so many reboots of the Legion right now. I think we're on like 6, and that's not counting like all the different spin-off books and like other interpretations of the Legion that have been out there. Like,
yeah, I think Geoff Johns' retro boot got brought back in the current Justice Society book.
Yeah,
or something. I don't know. I don't think it's not up to that far on like the regular subscription version of the DC app, so I don't think I'm up for that yet. But that's what I see on Twitter. So
there have been so many versions of the Legion, and this is the series that really sort of makes that happen. So let's look at Valor. So Valor is I'm insisting on us looking at because for two reasons. One, I actually consider Valor a part of the Superman family because it is Mon-El. It is Superboy's big brother. Like you kind of have to look at it that way. And he plays the role of Superboy in the 5 years later Legion books, as well as in the reboot era stuff. But at this point, we're still dealing with the 5 years later stuff, which they rewrote it so that instead of Superboy being the inspiration for the Legion, it was Valor, which is the new name for Mon-El, who was a superhero in this era, like in the post-crisis modern era of comics, and that Superman actually teamed up with and named. He names him a man of valor to just like as a way of describing him, and that's like I think a really cool element that it's still Superman who names him.
And that's in the Eclipso event, right?
Yeah.
The what event?
Eclipso, the villain Eclipso who can like possess people.
There was a series of annuals in 91, 92 where Eclipso like it eclipses all the characters in their annuals, and I think Valor defeats Eclipso in the end of it or something.
Yeah, so they set him up as like this like successor to Superman in this modern era, who then has so much esteem when you get to the future. And he's also a Daxamite instead of a Kryptonian, so his people are still around at this point, so he can be inspiring to, at the very least, Laurel Gand, who they create as a version of Supergirl to happen at the same time. And then we get into the SW6 Legion, which is like a bunch of clones, sort of, or time duplicates.
Yeah, I learned that.
Or time duplicates, which I believe this is the issue that goes into that all.
Yep, it is.
So
I think this is where I was like, I don't understand anything what's happening anymore.
So disclaimer going forward, like I'm old enough that I read like the Legion back in the 80s, and like I had a lot of Legion issues between like 83 and like 87 or something, and then the minute Keith Giffen took over, I dropped the book just because I didn't like the direction it was going, and I don't like his no disrespect to the man who passed away recently. I don't like his art style. I don't like his writing style in general. So I have no idea what's going on in this era. I did not read 5 years later. I don't know what's going on with all the clone stuff. So I'm just going to sit back and let y'all talk.
Okay, so this is just another chance for me to vent about 5 years later, because 5 years later goes off the rails after Giffen leaves the books. And I'm not saying that he should have stayed on the books. He was done. He was definitely done. Like, I'm not saying it was still on the rails prior to that point, but he was done. And they set off with this whole scenario where they launched the book Legionnaires as a spin-off to Legion of Superheroes, which was about the quote-unquote SW6 Legion, which was these young copies of the Legion from back before Pharaoh Lad died. So it's like all these like very specific versions of the characters. And then when Legionnaires launches, they rebrand themselves with new costumes and some of them with new code names. It's a weird system where some characters are still like Cosmic Boy and Saturn Girl, and then like other characters are like Live Wire. Like it's not consistent for like what the criteria for who is. Like Ultra Boy stays Ultra Boy, and adult Ultra Boy changes his name to Jade Dragon, and like there's a whole arc that goes on with like the Legion being declared like enemies of the state and going on the run. That makes no goddamn sense and is stupid. And this is why in this issue that we're looking at, Cosmic Boy is wearing the dumbest goddamn costume that he has ever worn. Well, I shouldn't say the dumbest costume. Why Cosmic Boy is wearing the weirdest costume he's ever worn.
He looks like a martial arts guy.
Yeah. Yeah. And how we end up with a scenario where we have like all these duplicates of all these characters that they really have to work hard at explaining, because like previously they were clones and not time copies, and it didn't really work that well because some characters like Chameleon, for example, like the young version of him died, and they were being joined by the mentor, older version of the character. Valor, actually, weird scenario. The older version of Valor, the younger version of Valor died. The older version went back in time and had to like redo all of his adventures that like earn the reputation of him being the greatest hero of all time, and then going back into the Phantom Zone for 1,000 years. So the version of Valor we're looking at in this book has done 2,000 years in the Phantom Zone.
What?
And is he the same Valor that gets put into the quote unquote like stasis zone by Superboy in his own title?
Well, yes, exactly.
Later?
It's not the version from that reality by Superboy. This is the one from the 90s series that like Superman named a man of valor. He's stayed in time, and then I guess at some point he yeah, it gets really weird. It gets really weird.
And that's why they got rebooted.
Yeah, Valor is one of like the really hard parts to go through on this one. But yeah, and that's why like there's like an old version of Brainiac 5 that they just call B5, who's wearing like an exosuit and has like long hair and like weird ass glasses.
Yeah, that confused the hell out of me. And I was like, who the heck is this guy?
This is just a weird book. And this is where they also introduce that the Time Trapper is a version of Cosmic Boy. They show it in the shot.
He pulls like his hood back, and I was like, is this just Valor but like 1,000 times older? Because that's how they made it seem.
No, so it becomes this whole situation where like, so the Time Trapper can be whichever Legion. It's usually a Legionnaire in the future. Like it's whomever, and that like the Time Trapper can't be destroyed. He will just be like remade by destiny. Like someone will become the Time Trapper at some point. And so it has been different characters, but in this story it is Cosmic Boy. And then Superboy shows up. Who is, I guess, supposed to be the Pocket Universe Superboy. And this is, I think this issue specifically is the one that more reinforces the idea that it's the Pocket Universe Superboy, because at this point in time, both in this series but in other Legion series, they go to the Legion Garden where they have all of the statues of former members, and they're like, don't you remember Superboy? It's like, how could we forget Superboy? Right, his death was such a big deal, but oh, you're right, we have forgotten him. Like the way that time is just like being rewritten for all of them. There's a Dark Star in one of these panels who had been a Green Lantern prior to some kind of revision. Just a note that's like a thing that's happening. And then Superboy, after like really inspiring them and then disappearing and them immediately forgetting who he was, disappears, and like the line that he was saying cuts over to the Superboy issue. So like I wanted to talk about it at least because like the Pocket Universe Superboy gets only so many appearances, and this is like one of them.
See, I tried to read this one. It didn't make any sense, but I've read the Superboy one a bunch of times. And I've read the Pocket Universe story a bunch of times. It never occurred to me this was supposed to be Pocket Universe. I assumed this was just supposed to be, okay, this is a crazy alternate reality from the post-crisis where, Clark Kent became Superboy at a young age.
So I took it that way specifically because in the Legion books around this time, they are dealing with the fact that they have the corpse of the Pocket Universe Superboy in their possession.
Okay.
Because he's buried in the garden with all the Legionnaires, and they talk about this, and then he shows up right here.
Right. Well, sorry, I know we're not on the Superboy yet. I'll hold that up.
Oh, no, we can move on to that one next. Like, okay. I think we can, as long as we don't, like, accidentally do the same one twice, I am fine. So.
Okay. I think it's written well enough that, you could, like I said, I'd never tried to read that issue of Valor before, but I've read the Superboy story a bunch. And I think it's written well enough that if you were of this age, that you were at least remotely familiar with pre-crisis continuity, like I was, as a kid, like, oh, clearly this is supposed to be, their take on, saying that pre-crisis Superboy is a alternate timeline crazy caused by time shenanigans.
Yeah.
Just very well done.
Yeah, and I think that made sense to a lot of people. Like, this was a good issue to get people in because Superboy is really well known outside of the comics in a way that most characters are not. Like, Superboy at this time very recently had a TV show.
Oh, true.
and that TV show had a comic book, which was, effectively very similar to the Superboy that we're seeing in this. Superboy as a general concept is really, understandable to most people. And if like Lana Lang's in Superman 3, like if you know the Superman detail and you just remember generally like, oh, and he was Superboy when he was a boy, then this issue is really clear. We also do get a tribute. It's not exactly posed the same way, but it is a tribute to the John Byrne Pocket Universe Superboy fight, with them like floating over Smallville. And then we also get like the Smallville sign, which is like such a nice like detail there. Like this cover is great. I do want us like to spend a moment just to be like, yeah, this tells you exactly what you need to know about this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Like having, I don't know. I think one of the things that hurts the Superman line in 94 is the fact that Grummett isn't on the book anymore. So
he's so good.
Yeah, and like Barry Kitson becomes a very good artist later. In 1994, Barry Kitson's not my favorite Superman artist, so Adventures hurts. But man, seeing this issue of Superboy with him drawing a version of a young Clark is so great. And I'm convinced that in 1994, a young Geoff Johns read this book and said, what if this happened, but it was really, really ultra violent? Let me write that. Let me write that miniseries in 2006.
There is evidence supporting the fact that he read this issue. He was a noted fan of the Superboy series at the time, and there is a letter that he wrote in around this time where he pitches his whole Lex Luthor being the father of Superboy plan, which leads me to think that he either didn't read the annual that would, I think, comes a year later, the year one annual for Superboy, or didn't care because it doesn't.
No.
I'm a noted hater of the retcon for Lex Luthor. I don't mind it in other adaptations. I thought that they set up too much backstory to just say that like, oh, it actually was Lex the whole time without doing some serious explaining, which they didn't do. And if they had done it, I would respect it, but they didn't.
That's my problem with a lot of Geoff Johns in the 2000s, that he just tosses out so much of 90s continuity and just graphically kills characters he didn't like. While, I could go on a Superboy Prime really is Geoff Johns rant for a half an hour, but I won't.
Yeah, that's fair.
So, yeah.
I mean, I just have beef with Geoff Johns.
Yeah,
period.
For sure.
But man, speaking about that art, we open with like this beautiful splash page of Superboy flying around this like plane. It looks so goddamn good. And then he like catches up with the plane. This is like a really good introduction to Superboy. Like he catches up to the plane and he's talking to Double X, and like you get their relationship pretty well. And we get motherfucking Crypto.
Yeah, Crypto is that's a really fun version of Crypto.
I love this version of Crypto. A little yappy bitch, like it's so great.
It's really fun, and just the fact that Bibbo is the one that fished him out of the water in a scene that makes me cry.
I know it's
every
so
time
emotional.
I reread it. And he was going to name him Krypton, but the chiseler who was running the dog tag place, skimped on the names. Like, fine, he's Crypto-Den. And it's just wonderful. And I love Double X. I love how much Kessel, I had to look at my phone, just embraces Cadmus in this run. And then late when he comes back to the book after Ron Mars's run too. But yeah, it's just a delightful series in general, and this issue is like one of the peaks of it.
Yeah, Kessel and Grummett really like the Kirby stuff. They really lean into the Cadmus stuff in this era, and then, as you alluded, when they come back after a hiatus from the book, they really go into Kirby stuff. And they have done some very Kirby-esque books outside, like as collaborators outside of Superboy stuff. They did Section Zero, which is a Fantastic Four and Challengers of the Unknown love letter series.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, like they love to do deep cut Kirby stuff. Like there's so much stuff down the line in Superboy that is just like Kirby's time at DC, like just a love letter to all of it.
Even though Grummett's not a part of it, I also highly recommend the Guardians of Metropolis miniseries that Kessel did in '95, which is all kinds of Kirby. It's the Boss Moxie and the Female Furies and the Newsboy Legion and the Guardian. It's just all smushed together. It's wonderful.
You're speaking my language.
Yeah.
But anyway, so this plane gets damaged though, and that's when Superboy shows up. And God, is that such a good looking Superboy? Again, Grummett is just a great artist on this one. And we get this wonderful shot of the two Superboys on the opposite sides of the plane trying to move, or like trying to support the plane in their respective ways. And it's really cool. I love again, there's a lot of information being conveyed in this about what is different about this Superboy from the classic Superboy that presumably most people picking up this book are going to be more familiar with. Like, I picked this book up because I was like, oh, that's really cool. The Superboy I'm familiar with this new Superboy who I've wanted to check out. Like, that's a cool juxtaposition. Let's find out more. And this does a really good job of like being like, all right, this Superboy is a clone. This Superboy is telekinetic. This Superboy doesn't have supervision. This Superboy gets by on luck in a different way than the classic Superboy. The Superboy is a music nerd and also, part of Cadmus and all the weird genetic stuff and all that jazz. And then we get like the whole like altering of time stuff going on. Like the sign is there when Superboy shows up. Like that's pretty cool.
And you mentioned him being a music nerd. There's just a really fun scene in here where he's in Smallville and he just starts chatting up the girl in the record shop, and they're like dropping actual like 90s alternative bands like PJ Harvey and stuff like that. I'm like, oh, that's just fun.
Yeah. I mean, they were having such a great time, like sort of setting up like what was cool about the Superboy, and like he's loaded with 90s-isms, which is fun. But I also like the idea where it's like, I mean, let's face it, bet they've never seen anyone like me before, and then like Superboy is like shown like sneaking into town by way of his classic like burrowed entrance into his parents' like house in downtown Smallville, and then we get him encountering Lana Lang, which is like really fun, having like classic Clark Kent encountering like post-crisis Lana Lang, who knows that Clark is Superman, that knows all this stuff.
Yeah, I always feel bad for post-crisis Lana, but because I feel like Byrne, when he established her character, just so misused that character. But I think she's one of the characters with the most potential in post-crisis, and so it's just kind of neat to see, like you said, more or less pre-crisis Superboy interacting with adult Lana.
Yeah,
it's kind of fun.
I have mixed feelings about that because I see what you're saying, like her as being like this all like in love with Clark and can never be with him kind of character feels like she's getting kind of the shaft. But on the other hand, he does make her extremely sympathetic in a way that like honestly pre-crisis Lana wasn't. Like she's kind of shrewish and like she's kind of a bitch. Like she's always like trying to break up whatever relationship Superman and Lois has, and she's Lois but worse in a lot of ways. Right. And so I think that like post-crisis Lana is way more sympathetic. I think especially when you look at Superman for All Seasons, you get a very sympathetic take on the character. And since that's the version I was like really more introduced to, like I take a very sympathetic approach to her as a result, and it was actually like kind of shocking for me to like go back into older stuff and be like, oh man, she's like kind of mean, like she's like the mean girl like to Lois. And it's good storytelling. It's like it's good to have a character like that, but like in terms of making her like likable, I do think she got a little bit of a better end in post-crisis continuity up until then Smallville comes around, and then it resets the whole relationship in everyone's mind of being like, oh right, yeah, they're longtime lovers or not or not longtime sweethearts.
Yeah, hated that or not too. Did not like Lana in Smallville. No. I'll be the first one to say it.
No. Same. Yes, I much prefer the Smallville version of Lois to the Smallville version of Lana.
Well, yeah, I mean, Erica Durant's pretty amazing in general.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so we have Superboy kind of like go into town and like look around. Meanwhile, Lana tries to talk to this like young version of Clark, and we note that reality is kind of reshaping and it's like kind of weird. And then we get the scene that you alluded to where Superboy is at the record shop. Mm-hmm. And I dig the scene because like small town Kansas is a place where you're going to find like a cool record store. Like a downtown at like a town that is trying to have like kind of a young scene is going to be a place where like you'll find like the weird shit or like the really good shit, like someone who like really curates their like portfolio.
Yeah, there's a town that's about a half an hour drive from me. It's actually the one where no, never mind. I'm not going to go into that, but where a certain event happened at a certain rally a couple months ago. But it's a really cool small town, and there's like a really cool comic book shop and a really cool record store in there. So reading this, I'm like, oh yeah, I can totally see that being in Smallville.
Yeah, exactly. But Superboy hears like someone just like screaming about fucking robots and someone being an insect queen and all that, and like pops in to be like, hey, this is like kind of weird. This young lad who's having a nervous breakdown is like, what's going on? Excuse me, I'll be right back. And then pops in with such a dope "You're Not Superboy," and you can goddamn bet that this is going to be the cover image of this episode art.
There you go.
I have already started working on it. Yeah, so amazing shot of Superboy punching Superboy. Just you feel the momentum of it all, and like the lightning and everything. It's just getting bad. And we established very quickly that the 90s Superboy is not a match for the original Superboy. They just in terms of raw power.
He just ricochets off of young Clark, and just the hammer. Young Clark's doing all these hammer blows on him, and it's brutal.
Yeah.
You can almost see Connor Kent getting killed by a Precar's version of Superman.
Yep, maybe. Which, to be fair, like post-crisis Superman wouldn't have done much better in that fight.
Yes, you're right.
Because we've established that pre-crisis Superboy is just that much more powerful than post-crisis Superman, and Superboy has never been presented as being as powerful as Superman. Like we know that. It like there's a chance he might like kind of come up close to matching him if he gets to being an adult. Like we've seen versions that are pretty damn powerful of like adult versions of Superboy, specifically the Titans Tomorrow version we saw, the Sins of Youth version we saw, and then we saw Black Zero. So we've seen versions of Superboy where he's an adult and like is a true powerhouse. But let's just be honest here. The pre-crisis Superman is just not gonna like, it's not going to be a fight. Like he's so powerful, relatively speaking. But anyway, so Superboy, the pre-crisis Superboy, the young Clark Kent. Clark Kent flies to the Kent's house, the Kent's farm, to try to find them. And Mon-El Kent, 90s Superboy, stops it. I'm sorry, it's hard when the fight is between two Superboys. But we do get like some nice like 4-panel shots of like the difference of the two Superboys' powers, like Mon-El using the telekinesis to hurl a bunch of logs, Superboy using his heat vision. And then they come to an agreement or like a ceasefire at least, when they see one of these like time alteration things occurring. And that's when that's when the pre-crisis Superboy realizes that he is not from the right time and sort of like gives up on it. And it had been hinted that he was like fighting to hold on to reality. Like he says that to Lana, that it feels like he's being pulled away. And so he gives in and like charges the young Superboy to continue on in his stead and be, a successor to Superman, sort of, because he also like, I'm not clear how much pre-crisis Superman understands when Superboy says it's like, I'm kind of like a young Superman, I'm a clone. Like if he understands like what the dynamic is, but
right,
it's all fine.
At least carry on my name. But yeah, I think you're right. I think it's implied that when pre-crisis or pocket universe Superboy gives up, he kind of also gives up his hold on reality. I do agree with that quite a bit.
I thought he just got pulled somewhere else.
No, as far as I know, he never shows up again after this, except for then there's the hypertension storyline in Superboy, like 5 years later, when Kessel and Grummett come back, where the character shows up again. But at that point, is it really the Pocket Universe Superboy? Who can say? Like probably not by that point.
Because I think hypertime had been established by then, so you could do.
Oh, it's not just has been established. It is them reveling in hypertime as a concept.
Yeah, is one of Mark Waid's best contributions.
Yes, let's all pour one out for our dearly departed Walter West.
Right.
But so we get the young Superboy explaining the whole situation to Double X, And I like the things of like nice folks that said I reminded them of their son, like cute little bits. And then the projection of Superman that is going out to all the heroes shows up.
Mhm.
And we get this sort of like parallel image of the of a poster of Hawaii, like a billboard for Hawaii, like come visit the home of Superboy, to juxtapose with the poster of like visiting Smallville, home of Superboy. And I like that juxtaposition right there, because it kind of creates the situation of like, well, what was that billboard before it became the Superboy billboard that we saw at the beginning of this? Oh, it was a Superboy billboard. It was just, advertisement for the Hawaii Tourism Board.
Yeah. Really, really good issue, just all around. One of the, like I said, out of Kessel and Grummett's initial run on the book, probably one of the highlights.
Yeah, great issue, like pulling out all the stops, and really does a great job of explaining what is going on with this book if you're just jumping on.
Hmm.
In my opinion.
Yep,
Jmike, do you agree? Like, are you?
I mean, there are some confusing bits here or there, but it is a great jumping point. It has some really good shots, though. It's a really good shot. Some of the best shots of this whole arc.
So just because this is the next tab in my list, and I think it's probably the most fun of the other issues to talk about, let's look at Superman, the Man of Steel, number 37.
Yay. I love this one. I love this issue.
Superman, I have an urgent message to tell you. Wait a second.
Yeah, so let's open with the cover, and the cover is a fuck ton of Batmans, and they're all drawn really goddamn well by Bogdanovich. By Bogdanove.
Right. When we talked about the dominance effect a while back, I said that one of Bogdanove's strengths is his ability to emulate other art styles. This is nowhere else is that on display as much as it is in this issue.
Yeah, I mean, just look at that cover. You got the animated Batman on there. You've got classic Batman. You've got all these different versions going on. You've got the Dick Sprang, and you've got like, oh man, there's just so many ones there.
Yeah, you got the super long ears one right in there.
There's the cereal. There's the cereal from the 40s looking at the cover, like on the right side, kind of towards the middle. Like,
yeah,
Carmine Infantino. Like, yeah, there's so much good stuff here.
Yeah, it's just, and also much like with the dominance effect of the four Superman actual tie-in, not counting Superboy, I think this one is the strongest.
I think that's fair. Here.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't know. I reread this issue a lot. When I moved a few years ago, I had to get rid of my whole collection because I just had nowhere to keep it for when we moved to. Yeah, and so
that is.
And so when I started recollecting, this is one of the first issues that I went out and recollected. I like it so much.
Nice. On that note, the issue opens with an arc that I don't have great things, like one that I'm like, oh, I guess this is still happening, which is the Jeb character who was hitting on Lois during the Death and Return arc of Superman,
the true villain of Rayner the Superman.
Right, yeah. Exactly. So this is a reminder that he still exists, and it's like, oh, but Clark's back. Are you really, like, Clark is like 6'3", like, yeah, and like built, and this is post-crisis Superman, like post-crisis Clark, who is like
takes no crap.
Yeah, he's a workout guy. Like, not really, but he pretends to be, and like has to do a lot to be like this nice but like giant man. Like, he towers over the dude. The first page has him just like looming over him. And yet we have that plot line. But Superman gets an urgent summons by Batman, and when he shows up, it's Batman as far as we can tell, but it's like, wait, I thought Batman had his back broken.
Yeah. He's got that technology from Dark Knight Rises.
Yeah.
He just puts the brace on, he's good to go.
So he shows up and he's got this like Neil Adams kind of style to him, which I think is fantastic, but it's subtle enough that you're not going to pick up on it immediately.
And I also appreciate the fact that as you're reading this, there is something that looks a whole lot like baby Kal-El's birthing matrix zipping through our solar system.
Yep. Yeah.
You see that on the second page with Batman.
So then we've got Jimmy and Ron just kind of checking out the concert that they're all at. And that's when the mutant leaders, or pardon me, the mutant leaders, the mutant gang shows up from Dark Knight Returns. And so does the Dark Knight Returns Batman.
Yep.
This is a great send up. Like, this is a fantastic tribute to the Dark Knight Returns. Like the panel composition, the voiceover boxes, everything. It's such a spot on. Like I like, if you told me this was a Frank Miller page, if it wasn't for the characters that didn't fit in the page, I would be like, yeah, that makes sense.
Do I have a minute to go off on a really
go for it? Yeah,
wild tangent. Okay. I love the fact that Louise Simonson got to write a tribute to Dark Knight Returns, because I have done an insane deep dive on the character Cable from Marvel. I did like a whole podcast about Cable for a while, and I am absolutely convinced that Rob Liefeld's visual and personality take on Cable is supposed to be Bruce Wayne after the events of Dark Knight Returns.
Really?
And that eventually is what got Louise Simonson booted off of New Mutants. In fact, there's a panel in like one of Cable's first appearances where he's like tinkering with his mechanical arm, and it is a panel by panel shot of a scene from Dark Knight Returns where Bruce has his arm in this kind of bionic cast, and it's the same arm and everything.
This makes so much sense. We talked a lot about how we assumed a lot of what was going on with Louise Simonson's work at this time was in response to her being booted from New Mutants, corresponding to this era. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like having like a lot of thoughts about the like the not yet but like coming image wave.
Yes.
Yeah, that I'm just going to add that to my canon of it all, because that like makes so much sense. Because you look at all the characters, like you can't help but feel like even Doomsday himself is kind of a commentary on this whole thing.
And the Underworlders being the Morlocks.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
All that stuff.
But yeah, so we get a spot on Dark Knight Returns send up. We have some love for the Dark Knight Returns on this podcast. We recently did an episode about that comic. It's a good one. And it treats Superman better than I think people gave it credit for a long time. But here we've got multiple Batmans talking to each other, which is great. I love the different style of Batman, and I love the different art styles on display. Like what's amazing is that Bogdanove could have easily had Superman start to look more like one or the other styles, because he's kind of like in the middle anyway, but he still looks like classic Bogdanove. And then you've got this very Neil Adams and this very Frank Miller Batman, like in an argument, like if I told you draw a person the way you would draw a person, and then draw a person the way this other person would draw a person, and then draw a person the way this other person would draw a person, and like, wouldn't you go a little insane?
Right. Oh, I also want to point out the fact that when Neil Adams' Batman first shows up, he refers to Superman as a hippie.
Yeah.
For having long hair.
You're not going hippie, are you? What?
I think that's very funny.
Yeah. Then we get OG Batman showing up.
Mm-hmm. Again, emulating the original art style, like to a T.
Yeah. And then we actually have a Batman swap, and I recognize the art style, but I couldn't name the artist.
Yeah, it's the guy who was drawing the Batman book that Doug Monk was writing, where he has like the really long ears, and he did like the version of Dead Man that would later, the super gaunt version of Dead Man and all that stuff. I can't remember his name either, just because I don't keep up with Batman very well.
Yeah. Sorry, we're not authorities on Batman stuff on this Superman podcast. But we get a scene of mutants with a tank, which is very much like the Batmobile in Dark Knight Returns.
Yeah.
Their attack concert. And there's some cool shots in here, and then there's vampires. And
yeah, it's Jimmy's rock star vampire kind of sort of girlfriend, Babe.
Yeah.
I was very confused because it looked like she got shot. It looked like she got shot on stage. I was very confused, and it kind of went nowhere. And I was like, "What?" And then she turned into a bat and flew away. And I was like, "What?"
Yeah, that was just kind of a meandering subplot in the Superman books at this time. It's that Jimmy had a friend who he kind of had a sort of romantic relationship with who just happened to be a vampire. And okay. And I think it goes back to the Dark Knight over Metropolis story arc from like 1990 or something.
Yeah. And then the Batman starts switching off rapidly between different types of Batmans that they are, which is a great chance to strut one's artistic self, or like artistic stuff, like doing just a great job there, just showing like all these different permutations of it. Like I said, I think we get a Dick Sprang in there. We get just so many amazing artists on this one. And then Metron shows up.
Yeah.
And then Jor-El and Lara show up. And this is the only one that like kind of directly leads into another one, because at least there's that.
What do you mean? The other Legion book leads into the Superboy book.
Oh, that's fair. That's 100% true.
Does it? I was really hoping it did.
Yes, because Superboy, because he is saying something and then it finishes the line in the Superboy book.
He's giving his big rah-rah speech to hype everybody up. And then poop.
Yeah, actually, just for the record, what he says...
His big Independence Day speech.
Yeah, so he says, now let's get to work. And that's how so it's now let's get to, and then he cuts off, and then he says work when he first appears in the Superboy book. So that's just a fun little element. So you are right. Superboy is the other one that like directly leads off. So that picks up over with Superman 93, if we want to jump over to that one.
So one last little detail I want to talk about from the Man of Steel issue. On the very first panel, a great little detail that you didn't need if you weren't reading the Superman books at the time, but if you were, is that this issue mostly takes place in Centennial Park. In the background of the first panel, you can see the ruins of Metropolis from the aftermath of the fall of Metropolis.
Oh, yes. Thank you for mentioning that one. I recalled that at the time when... like when I was reading this, I was like, oh, right. Yeah. The Fall of Metropolis story. So yes, thank you for mentioning that. So that was the big head, like coming to a head of the Lex Luthor Jr. storyline. So that I read an issue. What was it? Action Comics 800?
7. I don't remember.
I don't know. It was like one, it was like a big one.
Yeah.
Was that so I've read that issue, but I all I just kind of remember is like Lex Luthor's body was like breaking down, and then he like initiated some sort of like big explosion on his properties or something like that.
He was about to stand down, and his assistant Sidney Happerson unleashed a series of subterranean torpedoes that destroyed the Daily Planet and several other buildings, but they didn't destroy Newsmax, because that was where it was first revealed that Calvin Thornton was in fact the Lord Satanus, who used his magic to redirect the missiles to destroy LexCorp Tower.
Ah.
What?
Yeah, so, yeah.
Yep. Comics,
man.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yep. So thank you for bringing that one up, because that is one that I knew was an event that happened, but it's not one I actually really have read. So I appreciate you bringing it up. I just remember the artwork for like that Metropolis is gone, or Metropolis is destroyed.
Right. Yeah, it's got like the cover where like the Daily Planet building is falling down to the street, and the globe, and Superman's like trying to hold it back while Lois like runs up toward the camera. It's a great cover.
But anyway, Superman 93, which is the continuation of that. So looking at that cover, we've got Superman being pulled back by the Kents while he leans into Jor-El and Lara. Classic kind of Superman like being torn between his two parents stuff. We've got we open with Supergirl. We needed her somewhere. She doesn't have her own book yet, so that this isn't that interim period between her association with Lex Luthor and her getting her own series where she became an angel.
What?
Yeah.
Comics.
At this point, she's still a protoplasmic entity that can shapeshift.
Mm-hmm.
Comics. Anyway.
Wait, is this during the time that Lex had like a full head of red hair?
No, this is right after, because
just after.
Yeah, because it was revealed that he was a clone and that his body like broke down, and so he was like kind of.
If I'm going to die, I'm going to take Metropolis with me, which is how Metropolis got destroyed.
And then, if I remember correctly, he was still a withered husk until he sold his soul to Neuron, right?
Yeah, he had started to come back in Man of Tomorrow #1, which was a few months before. like his consciousness had gotten downloaded into the Kryptonian battlesuit, and then that got downloaded back into his body, so he was functional again, but he was still like super thin and unhealthy. But he gets to be peak Lex after Underworld Unleashed.
Yeah.
Buff but bald Lex.
Yep. Yeah. So it's one of those things about comics where, like, at some point you're gonna have to talk about the time that all of DC's supervillains sold their soul to the devil.
Yeah.
But anyway, back at this time-altering reality story thing, Superman's broadcast is going off. Supergirl is hearing it, and then the real Superman actually shows up as they stop this like rocket ship from like falling down. They land in Metropolis, and that's when they get the phone call from the Kents that Jor-El and Lara have shown up, and Superman flies over to deal with it. And this read to me very much like a lot of like 60s era, like what if Krypton didn't blow up kind of stories, which were then, taken, like played grimdark by Alan Moore in For the Man Who Has Everything, like showing off Krypton, like if it actually hadn't blown up and how bad that would get. This is less crap sack than that. This is much more like, no, Krypton's like actually like going, you've got a brother, dude.
Right. And I would say not only is this the version of Krypton that didn't explode, this is the version of Lara that doesn't hate her own son. Because every time we've seen Lara before this, both in Man of Steel and in that one issue of Superman drawn by Mike Mignola, where he somehow goes back to Krypton before it's destroyed, Laura's like, "Oh, you're so gross, get away from me." And here she's like, "Oh, my son."
Yeah. It's like kind of a nice little moment for Superman, sort of like he's like happy to have them, and he's able to like connect with them for a moment, and he even like almost gets to have them be a part of his life for a moment before they're like wiped away, and then he's like so sad that like time has stripped him of his biological parents again. But he has to like go back and be like, "No, I swear, I love you, Mom and Dad, my adopted parents." Which I'm sure is a heartfelt emotion, but at the same time, it does kind of suck for them to like be watching this whole scene.
Yeah, it's like I found my birth parents, and if I only could go off with them, I would, but I can't. So I love you.
Right. Especially again, there's this whole like weird element of like, well, what reality is the right reality? Like, I guess he might be wondering, like, well, maybe they're just like straight up telling the truth. Like maybe Krypton isn't gone, but This would be a weird time to show up, with all the time like he's already put his warning message out to everyone that the time crisis is going on. Like he knows that it's like a time crisis thing.
Right. I just want to say, I really like the little bit with his brother from this alternate time, like Van-El, who reminds me a lot of kind of like pre-crisis Jor-El and the World of Krypton backup stories, where he's just kind of a cool adventure scientist, and I just really like that. That's a lot of fun. I want to know more about Zan-El.
Yeah, he's got the headband going for him, and like cool stuff. I love the commitment to this whole era of like, oh, we had to like come up with a thing to let us leave Krypton because of the Eradicator. Like, that's a plot point, and that's like several years later they still have to be like, yeah, we couldn't leave Krypton because the fucking Eradicator. Like, yeah. just gotta explain away how we could even leave in the first place. Gotta cover that part there.
Yeah.
I do like the bodysuit also for the Kryptonians. Like I like being reminded that they're all like kind of like locked in these like protective suits, and that like Zan is like the first Kryptonian not bred in a pod, is like the first one with like able to face the world without it.
Mm-hmm. And I like the commitment to the technology too, like the little building blocks that Zan is playing with when he's a little kid. They're those little egg-like things that kind of float in the air, and then when he's getting married, his wife's bouquet is those kind of like frilly things that the Kryptonians have on the sleeves of their suits.
Yeah, I really like that element of this era. Like, I feel like that's such a cool design look.
And I know that Brett Breeding is kind of like the prototypical inker for Dan Jurgens, but Joe Rubinstein does the inks in this one. He did the inks and on and off throughout Jurgen's run. I really prefer him as the inker. I think he gives Jurgen's art just a little bit of extra dynamism, and I just really enjoy him. I like it whenever Rubinstein shows up in the Jurgen's run.
Yeah, the issue looks really good.
But we get a very brooding Superman, and at the end, with the rain beating down on him, he's like, "Oh, only!" He's clenching his fist and very shadows. And Jurgens is very good at showing a very almost darkly determined Superman, because Superman's eyebrows disappear and he just gets these dark circles around his eye.
Yeah,
it's a lot of fun.
And then he has to pop back and be like, "Nope, still love you."
Yeah, love you guys, love you, Mom.
So let's move on to the adventures of Superman, or should I say the adventures of the Alpha Centurion.
Dun, dun, dun.
So this one does kind of what should be a table stakes kind of story where the hero shows up and everything is different. It kind of reminds me of in the end of Crisis on Infinite Earths, where Earth 2 Superman just wakes up and goes to work one day, and it's the Earth 1 or the new Earth, the fused Earth, but it's effectively the Earth 1 Daily Planet. So he goes in and goes into the editor's or the general editor's office or whatever, even though he's not actually that, because it's the wrong reality. So this one, Superman arrives at Metropolis, and it's the wrong Metropolis. It's a Metropolis with a different hero of Metropolis. He just kind of pops in, and here we go.
Yeah. Yep.
Which is kind of the reverse of what happened in the Superboy book. That is a hero showing up in the wrong version of their reality. In this one, he's showing up in the wrong version of his reality. And it creates this question of who's to say whose reality is the real one.
Right. I got to say also, even if this is a pretty fun story, we get a fill-in artist, which in Peter Krause. And I hate that this is kind of the weakest artistically of all the issues, because it is a fun story, but I don't know.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a bummer. Because I like the Alpha Centurion as a concept. I also now realizing that it's a guest artist, imagine that he, or perhaps the inker, didn't realize that the bodysuit was supposed to be gold for the Alpha Centurion, and I think that makes the look make way more sense to me now that I realize that, because I like the accents that kind of look like that sort of breastplate kind of chest armor.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that his bodysuit is blue has always been weird. I'm like, oh, if that's supposed to be gold, that actually makes me like this look a lot more.
Right.
It's closer to what the alternate look will be when they get the revised look, when he becomes a mainstay DC character who gets referenced randomly and is not very important, but is still kind of fun as an Exo-Man of War XP.
And it feels like a wasted opportunity that when the main continuity version of Alpha Centurion showed up, he never hooked up with Maxima. The two of them would have been the perfect couple.
My God, yeah. That's a pairing right there. But the Alpha Centurion also was never as impressive a hero as he was in this alternate timeline. In this timeline, he is the Superman of their timeline. He is literally a Superman analog. But in his I keep wanting to say 616 because that's the Marvel way of saying it, but
Earth Zero.
But the New Earth or Earth 1 in the main continuity version, he is just not that cool. His story is fine, and he has a perfectly fine miniseries that explains his origin and sets up that the alien benefactors were actually going to dominate Earth and all that jazz. But yeah, he's never going to be that important.
No. I also say, without his helmet, he looks a lot better in the main continuity too. Here, he's got kind of a brown bowl cut, and then when he shows up later, he's got these glorious golden curls.
Yes,
he just looks a lot cooler without the helmet.
Yeah, well, they kind of make him look more like Alexander the Great.
Mm-hmm.
which
Yeah.
is good from a design standpoint, but also again is not a Roman look. Like he looks more Roman in his like original design, like the hair, the actual helmet design, everything is like a little bit more of this like Roman superhero, and instead they go for this more like Bronze Age Grecian superhero look, which I guess like kind of like the locks kind of make you think Alexander the Great.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a better look, like empirically speaking. Like the shield is a better design than the Roman long shield design that like this Alpha Centurion gets. It's just a better look.
Well, I think it's also a big part because when he shows back up, it's in Superman: The Man of Tomorrow, which is drawn by Tom Grummett.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's just a much fresher design versus this one, which is much more appropriate, but at the same time is kind of whatever. Like he's got 10 gauntlets and. That's it for
one
like,
of them has a blade.
Yeah, blade, and
because it's the 90s and everyone has to have a wrist blade.
Yeah, I'm cool with I'm cool with it for a Roman themed character, but for real. We got a shot of Kirby salvage that Superman drops, like these like robots he's fighting in, by the way.
Yeah,
which is always fun. And then they go to Centurion Park because like this is a city that has. I'm curious what this like alternate history was with the Alpha Centurion, like how big of a parallel has he been? Like, I don't think they get into like, did he fight Doomsday? Like, did he deal with like, X, Y, and Z major story? Like, how does he fit in for Superman in so many ways?
Right. Like, and you get the feeling he kind of runs the city as well, because his Centurion squad who was run by Maggie Sawyer, is pretty much the cops. So you get the feeling he's like kind of introduced alien technology to Metropolis and has become kind of its de facto leader. I was surprised that the villain that shows up, Bloody Mary, isn't supposed to be an analog to anybody in the main universe. She's just like a whole cloth made up character, which like, okay, it was a choice.
Yeah, it's a choice. Like, is it a bad choice? Not necessarily. Like him having his own rogues gallery is fine. Like he doesn't need to. It doesn't need to be like Metallo,
Right. And of course, it's the 90s, so she's scantily clad. She's a quote unquote bad girl. But I'm always a sucker for like a 90s cybernetic character. That's always fun. And we get, instead of like LexCorp Tower, you have his skyscraper that's A-shaped. That's again a lot of fun.
Yep. Well, my big question is he's got the statue, and like that makes me think we've had some big moments that are akin to the Doomsday situation.
Right. Possibly.
I mean, my theory is that like in true like kind of Roman imperial style, he's just kind of like, set himself up as the most important person in the city and had a statue erected in his own tribute. But I mean, it's open for interpretation because we never really know.
No, that's fair. Like that's a good read on it. I mean, he does have like serving winches and stuff at his location.
I mean, at least they don't go the route that's like, well, yes, I'm from ancient Rome. Of course we have slaves. That I'm glad we didn't go that route.
Yeah.
But because the Romans weren't the best people, of course we have gladiatorial tournaments and people die for our amusement, but we didn't go that, which is, a good choice.
Yeah, it like doesn't have like the underworlders. He just like puts them in a gladiatorial.
Right. Team cluster.
Yeah. On that note, Lois is the love interest of Marcus Aurelius, the Alpha Centurion. In this reality, Superman tried to kiss her in the guise of Clark Kent earlier on, and that didn't go over well.
At all.
And she shows up here to be with Marcus, and like that's all well and good. And then Superman and Marcus Aurelius head off into battle, and that's it. Like he's in the rest of Zero Hour, but this is just sort of like a moment to like set up that character, and he's fine.
And a weird thing is that I think it's in issue 2 of Zero Hour where we get the scene of all the heroes of the day coming together to prepare to fight the crisis, which came out right before this issue, and that's actually where Alpha Centurion shows up. He just kind of you see him flying in from the side of the page, but all the heroes are showing up. But he's never referenced like, well, who the hell is this guy? Where did he come from? Oh, okay, well, we'll explain it in Adventures of Superman. So I just wonder if that was like an editorial goof, or it's like, oh, here's this new character that we're going to hint at. It just makes you wonder.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like it's certainly an interesting conversation about the type of hero that could replace Superman. You know, like Superman being the strong man, but also a man of the people and whatnot. Like, but like Superman having his powers be innate is its own approach to a superhero, but like a gadget superhero would make enough sense in a perspective. And so you could see like Marcus Aurelius as being like a conception of like, well, what is a superhero if instead of imagining Superman, Joe Shuster, like Siegel and Schuster, with Jerry Siegel, like came up with, you know, a tech themed kind of character.
Right. Like Steel.
Yeah, exactly. So this feels like that kind of an extrapolation, which is why we get like their own separate, you know, like here's our different rogues gallery and here's our different sort of circumstances that have led us to this position, just with like the overlap being like the shared people of Metropolis, because it's not like the reality is like being fully rewritten to different cities, because that would be a huge difference at that point.
Yeah. And you know, just like with Zan-El, I don't think they would have sold well, which is probably why they didn't go this route. But it would really need to get these alternate timelines fleshed out more, just to get a glimpse. So give us like a one shot to see what's the world of the Alpha Centurion like, you know, other than just a very, very brief glimpse. You know, what are some of the adventures that Zan-El had, you know, as this new breed of Kryptonian that's abandoned the bodysuit. Just things like that would have been really fascinating, just from a perspective of someone who's read these stories like 100 times by now.
Yeah. I mean,
is there a Batman? Is there a Batman in this universe?
Oh, in this universe, that's a good question.
That would be a really good question. Yeah.
Or does he have like his own like Roman version of Batman?
Yeah. World's Maximus. Yeah. So they leave, however, to engage with like whatever this crisis in time is. And I like that the Alpha Centurion says as they go, because like that, you know, reality might get rewritten. And he's like, my lifespan's 20 centuries. Like he's been alive for 2,000 years. Like it makes sense that he's kind of confident that like he's probably the character that's going to continue to exist, because like it's not like whatever revision in time is going to like wipe him away. And that's technically true. He does continue to exist. It's just in this like altered fashion where he shows up like, what's the official DC timeline? Like 7 years later, 10 years later, something like that.
Yeah. Something.
Nebulously, like he's showing up like a bit later, which this also corresponds to the introduction of Triumph, who is a superhero who is another Superman, but from a different, like, but we all forgot he existed. He's basically Sentry. Yeah.
Just the superhero everybody hated.
Yeah, Triumph. His powers were basically Magneto-style magnetism powers, which, you know, it's impressive that they leaned into that being like, oh yeah, that would be like a Superman level hero. But he gets introduced in Zero Hour as like, don't you remember me, Triumph, the guy who saved the day and founded the Justice League? No, never. No, we don't. And then he like gets shunted off to Justice League Task Force and does nothing until the Morrison run.
I will have a chip on my shoulder until Morrison does terrible things.
Yeah, Morrison makes him a villain.
Oh, yeah.
And a powerful villain at that.
Very powerful, yes. Good story.
Yeah. I do appreciate the story, even though like it did permanently make him like he's a villain.
Right. And that was still very, very late 90s. I was going to say, is another example of the 2000s kind of doing away with everything from the 90s it was ashamed of. But I think that was still, you know, like 99-ish.
Yeah, and then I just realized that Morrison did basically the same thing to Magneto, who has the same power set. And then I'm like, what did they have? Do they have a problem with people with magnetic powers? Like,
Right.
Maybe.
Plus, when Triumph gets a power upgrade from the fifth dimensional genie, his hair looks like Magneto's.
Yeah. I don't know. We're connecting dots here, connecting them magnetically.
Whoa!
Oh god!
As if those dots are made of iron. Iron dots.
Whoa.
Anyway, moving on. Next up and last up, I believe, is Superman in Action Comics 703. So yeah, it must be issue 700, which was the big Fall of Metropolis story.
Metropolis.
Yeah. So this one is the Back to the Future 2 scenario issue in this whole group, where people start fading away as a result of the time shenanigans. But we open with Superman fighting Starro the Conqueror, which I am here for. But this is a different art style than I would expect to see Starro the Conqueror in. I'll just say it that way. Like it's
the Jackson Geist style.
It's a particular 90s style that like Starro just doesn't fit in my brain.
Doesn't feel right.
Yeah, Geist, I don't know. I wouldn't say his style is realistic, but I think he leans into realism.
Yeah, there's like a verisimilitude to his work.
Right. Like, I've said this a lot, like on Twitter and on my own podcast and stuff, that when Geist does a close-up of an attractive woman like Lois or Cat Grant, it's like he's doing an early version of Greg Land, where it almost looks like something out of a fashion magazine. No, I don't, not that I think he's tracing or anything, but I think he's like, taking inspiration from poses and facial expressions from fashion magazines when he draws a lot of women. That goes like all the way back to his work in the like very, very early 90s on Doctor Strange, where he did some of the same stuff over there. But yeah, Geist is, I'm never quite sure if I like Jackson Geist's art style or not, but it's still striking one way or the other.
Yeah, that's a good way of describing it, because like it's the one that took me the longest to warm up to with like the Death and Return to Superman stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah. So mentioning that the Daily Planet is destroyed, we check in with the Daily Planet crew. They are in a temporary office, and Lois Lane is now that you say that it looks like an early Greg Land, I'm like, oh man, yeah, her eating that ice cream cone and having the ice cream cone change size from panel to panel. Certainly, yeah. Feels like what we're talking about. And then Perry starts to fucking disappear.
While Jimmy's wearing a 9 Inch Nails crop
top with like cut off sleeves, and Jimmy is really buff.
Yeah. 90s Jimmy is swole.
Jimmy Olsen.
Yeah. You can see why Cadmus wants his DNA so bad.
So Superman flies off to deal with the distortion fields. He flies to the Kent farm and finds a young Ma and Pa Kent. Oh, and I have to say, before he finds them, remember the shifting silo in the issue of Superboy? The silo shifts right in front of him and he crashes through it, which is a great touch. I don't think they actually connect those dots, but that is a great touch right there. It'd be amazing if the Welcome to Smallville sign was the young Superboy sign, but it's not.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because this is 1940s Smallville or something like that.
but that would be
young
real cool. And then so we find this like alternate reality where they've got the kryptonite and they found a dead baby instead of finding a living one.
Yeah. Super dark.
Yeah, very dark. And then we have this like 40s like gangster story.
Mm-hmm. Now the boss in this, the boss of the gangsters, the guy who left dead baby Kal-El, Emmett Vale, is the scientist from Superman #1 in 1987 who stole the birthing matrix and created Metallo.
Oh, perfect.
Only here he looks. Only here he kind of looks like Marlon Brando.
Yeah, no, that's some nice details.
Yeah,
thank you for catching that.
I appreciated that. Sure. Because that scientist isn't named for a long, long time in Superman continuity. I don't think they even gave him the name Emmett Vale until after Byrne left the book. So I just caught that kind of recently.
Not that I would necessarily remember that name. I'm sure if it was in there, that I would just be like, oh, cool. But yeah, I don't remember that as like one of the trivia bits back in the day.
Right.
But yeah, then we get some fucking robots, and Superman vs. Robots is a time-honored tradition.
The best.
Classic. It's a classic.
They're not quite the mechanical monsters, but they're real cool. They kind of look like the second Iron Man armor with the gold.
Oh yeah, the all gold one.
And kind of, I don't know, elements of the second version of Robot Man and Airwave, and I love those kind of robots. I just love big, clunky, like 1940s movie serial Flash Gordon robots. I just love it.
Yeah, I especially love the lack of a waist. You know, like how it like narrows to the, like just a pole, and then like just like a crossbeam for their like thighs. Like really fun stuff in the design.
And then like in the background, you've got like all those science devices that make electricity for no reason, and I think I just love that kind of stuff.
I will say this kind of makes me think of Geist's armor that he has Guy Gardner wear when he fights Superman, or like the Eradicator Superman in Return of the Superman arcs, just in terms of like similar design elements to the character.
Yeah.
But also, that might just be because I'm looking at a glowing gold armor versus another glowing gold armor that has like kind of a cross like a crossbeam eye design right there.
Right.
Anyway, so Superman aids the young Ma and Pa Kent from getting away from this gangster, and then he sort of steps back into his own time, and then is dealing with the fucking Linear Men, and we fade out and go right into 0 Hour.
Yes. And when he's kind of in between time with Larry Lee of the Linear Men, we get an effect that Geist doesn't do as well as Jurgens, but in this era, like time, like the essence of time is depicted as a rainbow, which I have come to love, and I just every time I see it, I'll throw it up on Twitter and just shout "Time Rainbow." And
I mean, is that even like that weird? Because like that is like pretty common with like Legion of Superheroes time travel, usually with like lines like to indicate it, but like the time waves are usually depicted sort of like that.
Yeah. Anyway, every time Wave Rider uses his power, he's like surfing on a rainbow. And...
I love that idea, though. Time Rainbow.
Yeah. Time Rainbow.
I feel like that's I feel like that's some merch coming.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Anyway, yeah. So that is So anyway, yeah. So Superman is then going off with the Linear Men, and time fades out. And I don't know where this was supposed to fall in the 0 Hour timeline. Like,
this is supposed to take place like right when Parallax wipes out all of time in 0 Hour #1, which is actually the 4th issue of 0 Hour.
Right, because it goes back.
They count backwards.
It counts backwards.
Yeah.
To issue 0.
Yes, because 90s were all about the gimmicks.
And I feel like that covers all the issues that we wanted to talk about today. Like I said, there was an issue of Steel that was on the list of books for us to look at, but when I read it, it was not at all 0 Hour tied in. It was just a issue of Steel. And then the next
It does a little bit just because a younger version of John Henry shows up in the present, even though he and present John Henry never interact. It's very subtle.
Then I didn't even notice that when I was reading it.
Like Steele's fighting these kind of generic Louise Simonson villain team, and younger John Henry in his like early 20s pops up out of time and does something that helps, but Steele never really finds out about it. That's kind of it.
Okay.
It's like Louise is like, I am not dealing with this 0 Hour shenanigans. It's not going to interrupt my story with these generic villains.
Yeah, so that is 0 Hour from the perspective of someone buying the Superman books. I like this event fine. I think it does fine as being an event. I think that it had lasting damage to the Legion of Superheroes, but I like what came out of it for the Legion of Superheroes. And that's like this like tough situation to be in when talking about that franchise. When talking about the broader DCU, did it do anything? Like it streamlined a little bit, but frankly, at this point, we had already sort of kind of gotten our like marching orders for like, here's how shit's working, and then this was like, here's our map of the timeline, and here's our whole timetable for what characters showed up when, and yada yada yada.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't. I would say, other than like introducing Jack Knight and other than introducing the reboot Legion, it doesn't really do anything for the DC of the time. I mean, you could argue that stuff like Conduit, who was introduced in the Superman 0 Month books, you could say that 0 Hour retconned Kenny Braverman into existence. Or you could just say, oh, we just never thought to bring him up before.
Right.
One of the two. Either way, it doesn't. Nothing nothing is really retconned significantly in any of the books. It's just like, here's a jumping on for DC stuff, and we're all going to take our books in some interesting directions, but we're not going to do anything really groundbreaking.
Yeah, which is, I mean, it's fine. Like, the event does not need to be earth-shattering. Like, I think that there's too much of a push for earth-shattering events these days, which is wild for a book where, like, literally the Big Bang is repeated.
Right.
But, you know, it's like, it is what it is. And I think the event itself is, like, pretty enjoyable. I think Extant has a cool design. I think that Parallax is so goddamn cool at this period.
It really is.
It's such a good costume.
It is. It's the best costume, and he's such an imposing villain. I mean, just a person who literally thinks they're doing the right thing, but they're so delusional they're willing to destroy the universe to get the job done. That's a compelling villain. You know, the best villains think they're the good guy.
Yeah. And that worked really well with Hal Jordan. Like, he's so iron-willed that, like, he gets this idea in his head and he is going to make it happen. And that includes, like, even making some tough calls, because he's always supposed to be the character who's able to make those tough calls, because he is iron-willed, you know, Green Lantern man.
Right. I'm a maverick.
Yeah.
I wish Hal had been around longer, even though he got really good send-off, even though his stuff with the Spectre was interesting. I just wish Parallax had been a bigger deal for longer than Parallax was. And I wish the Superman books had been had a little more oomph to them in 1994. I think in 1995, they start getting really, really awesome for a couple of years. But these 4 issues, you know, or I guess 5 issues if you're counting Superboy, are really fun. They're a really enjoyable read.
Yeah, I had a good time looking at all of these. I think we're all in agreement that the Man of Steel issue was, like, the best, like, pure Superman issue. But, like, for me, the Superboy issue is the best issue.
Oh, yeah.
Like,
I think it's because you just like 90 Superboy.
I do. I love 90s Superboy. But I think the art is just so good in that issue. And I think it does its job so well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But
Also,
it's not doing anything as, like, aggressively, like, out there as, like, the Man of Steel issue, where, like, we have all the different art styles in play. So, like, you know, I think that Grummett is, like, super safe, but at the same time beautiful. And I think Bogdanove is a bit more deliberate and a bit more aggressive, but is the more acquired taste.
Yeah, I was about to say that Bogdanove's an acquired taste, but once you get that taste, it's really, really good. He does, you know, he's not my favorite artist on Superman in the 90s. You know, that's, you know, going to be Grummett all day long. But I think he's the most interesting artist.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of very safe art on Superman. Like, you could almost say Jurgens is like the prototypical house style artist. And, you know, he's good, he's very solid, but he's not necessarily super interesting. Bogdanove's always really, really interesting.
Yeah.
Even when it's weird.
For real.
Don't say Parallax too loud. They might hear you and bring it back again.
Oh, well, as long
They
as we're not
almost
talking
did.
about the bug, I'm okay with it. Like, and even
no.
we're talking about Evil Hal here, and that's a good era for the character. I know people were really upset about it. I get it, but this is how I came. Like, literally, we just talked about the issue that like brought me into DC. Like, that was the status quo. Hal Jordan was the bad guy. Like,
yeah,
I was used to that being the deal. Now, that said, the JSA stuff that happens in the JSA, or, you know, in the fight in the main Zero Hour book, like, doesn't matter as much to me, because by the time I cared about the JSA, we had gotten the JSA Elseworld series, and we had gotten the start of the JSA. Like, we got the JSA like 5th week event that was the, like, sort of like soft lead in to the, like, Robinson and then later Geoff Johns JSA book. So, like, I started to care about the JSA as the JSA started to have material for me to care about. So this was just like a period where there wasn't any, and that's kind of why I don't have like a big feeling about it, because by the time I cared, I knew they were back, you know, a couple years later.
Yeah, I mean, like I always thought the original Dr. Midnight was really interesting looking. I have no feelings about him whatsoever. I like Peter Cross so much better. You know, I don't really have any feelings about Rex Tyler or Al Pratt or any of those guys, but, you know, I I like them more as people, the people carrying on their legacy than them as characters themselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, I do have to say that Ted Knight as Starman looks so good in that one issue right before he gets like super de-aged, where he's all buff and he's got the red kind of cowl thing instead of green. I'm like, or maybe the other way around. It's green instead of
green cowl instead of red. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like, man, that looks great. But then he gets super old, and then we get Jack Knight, so it's okay.
We get the Jack Knight Starman, and that is such a good Starman.
And then we get the Shade, which is just the best reinvention of a character of all time.
Yeah. Jmike, it is such a stretch for us to make a Starman-centric like series of episodes of the show. I don't know if we'll ever get a chance to like talk about Starman, but like, god damn, is Starman a good book?
I'll take your word for it.
If you need help finding a way to work in Starman, I will help you. That is worth talking about.
Starman.
I'm pretty sure Superman shows up in one issue of Starman, and that's enough.
Well, there's a really cool like crossover with Captain Marvel, where he has to deal with Captain Marvel and like has to like figure out how to use the rod for all of its like possibilities, because he's like, I'm so used to just using it for like shields and blasting stuff. And it's like, oh, it's actually like a gravity rod able to do, like all these cool tricks with gravity and electromagnetism and all this stuff. And he has to start using science to fight Captain Marvel. And that's so fucking cool.
That's cool. Absolutely.
Anyway.
They feel like characters that should be more intertwined than they are, just because they both have that kind of weird retro feel to them.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, for sure. Like between those two characters. But anyway, Grant, thank you for coming on and for suggesting that we talk about some Zero Hour stuff, because these are some fun issues. And yeah.
I truly enjoyed being here. Thank you. Thank you for having me again.
Of course. Yeah, it's always a blast having you on. And anytime you are welcome to come join us over here.
I will invite myself once again at some point in the future. Guys, let's talk about Zero Hour.
Meanwhile, where can people find you and follow you?
They can find me on the Truth, Justice, and Hope, a Superman podcast, which has been going through a bit of a hiatus for the last few months as my life has been massively chaotic, but I'm about to begin recording on a regular basis again. I talk about Superman comics that began with the return of the pre-Flashpoint Superman during Convergence, moving forward from there to more issues at a time. I am currently at the very beginning of the Bendis run. I'm about to start talking about his run on Action Comics in my next episode I'm going to record. And I know a lot of people have strong feelings about the Bendis run, so I encourage them to listen and give me their feedback. But they can also find me on Twitter at About Superman, where I just talk about random Superman shenanigans.
Nice. People should follow you and they should check out your podcast. It's always fun, and I've always appreciated I so much appreciate that we have all found each other, like us, like Superman fans, and we all have like such different niches for our respective podcasts. So yours is really fun. I encourage people to check it out.
Yes, the Superman online community is a fabulous place to be. It is just a beacon of positivity on an otherwise toxic social media site.
Yes, yeah, man. It's the thing that makes me so sad about what is happening to social media, specifically to Twitter, or as I refuse to call it, sorry, I had something in my throat there.
Right.
Yeah, no, because like comics Twitter has like some really like great spots, and like Superman Twitter specifically is really dope. Like it's a lot of like people who are very enthusiastic about the Man of Steel and like are supportive of each other. So yeah, check out Grant. Like all of us out there, like all of us Superman podcasters and Superman and Twitter people and whatnot. Like take a look, because it's a lot of fun. It makes Twitter worth going to. But after that, they should check out Jmike, because Jmike, you're part of that Superman Twitter family, even if you're fairly quiet.
What do you mean, Case? I don't know what you're talking about. But yeah, you can find me on Twitter at JMike101. Case usually shouts me out or tags me in things I need to respond to, because Twitter is just an app to me. I don't go on it unless I really need to. Yeah, that's where you can find me.
Yeah. Meanwhile, you can find me also on Twitter at Case Aiken. You can find me at most app-based platforms at Case Aiken, except for Instagram, where I'm holding on for dear life to my AIM screen name from high school, which is Quetzalcoatl 5, because I was pretentious and was not concerned if people could spell it back in the day. And now I have come to regret that, but I can't let it go. I can't let it go. It's my AIM screen name from high school. Otherwise, you can find me on our Discord server for certain POV. You can find Jmike too. If you tag him, he will actually respond. And he can give shout outs to our Discord server sometimes as well if he wanted to. But the Discord server is a lot of fun. We have great conversations going without it being so aggressively like so many messages that you can't like follow what's going on. So it's a good time. I highly recommend the CPOV Discord server. There's links on our website and all over the internet. So check that out. Come join us and have a good old time. But otherwise, we've got more awesome Superman content coming up. But until then, stay super, man.
Men of Steel is a certain POV production. Our hosts are Jmike Folson and Case Aiken. The show is edited by Sophia Ricciardi. Our logo is by Chris Batista, and episode art is by Case Aiken. Our theme is by Geoff Moonen.
Hey, Nerf herders.
You sure you want to go with that?
Hey, everyone.
There we go. More inviting.
Have you ever had a movie that you really wanted to love, but something holds you back?
Or one that you did love in spite of a flaw?
Well, I'm Case Aiken.
And I'm Sam Alisea.
And on Another Pass, we sit down with cool guests to look at movies that we find fascinating.
But flawed.
And we try to imagine what could have been done when they were made to give them that little push.
We're not experts. We just believe in criticism.
Constructive criticism.
Sure.
So come take another pass at some movies with us.
And every now and then, we can celebrate movies that did it on their own, too.
You can find us at certainpov.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Pass it on.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.